Yay! Welcome to Lunch with EFI. I'm Jay Green, joined by Ian Kingsbury. We're a light crew this week, and we'll have a light lunch. Only an appetizer and a main dish, no dessert. So, we're helping you keep your diet and stay healthy because that's important.
I normally don't feel like it's dessert after lunch. I mean, sometimes a little something, but
I know. Well, we splurge sometimes at EFI.
Right.
We have a common theme in our appetizer and main dish. The common theme is foreign fueled radicalism appearing in U.S. education. Ian's going to start us off in talking about how this is an issue in K-12 education. By discussing terrorist elementary.
So this was a story out of Texas within the last week or so, and there is a lawsuit being forth by parents of Muslim students there, alleging that schools of an Islamic extraction, or those that openly embrace the Islamic faith, have been excluded from the state's ESA program. And it sounds like no such exclusion has been applied to other religions, and so they're bringing forth this lawsuit. And so I'm not going to profess.
It's in response to an announcement by Abbott that he designated some organizations as terrorist organizations, including CARE, the Council of
American Islamic Relations.
Okay. And he then said he didn't want schools that were affiliated with terrorist organizations to be allowed to participate in the state's ESA program.
Which seems sensible. I don't know whether, in fact, all these schools that have been denied have any sort of affiliation with CARE.
What about this general principle? I mean, so do we want, now that we're expanding in a significant way into providing public subsidy for private education by having universal ESA programs in now 18 states or something like that, including Texas, which is one of our largest states, we now have the question of, well, okay, should those public subsidies go to any school that people want to attend, or should it be restricted in some way as to the nature of those schools?
Normally, I'm one to have pretty strong political convictions. I feel strongly about my righteousness on one side of an issue. This is one for me that's complicated, honestly.
Yeah, I remember we debated this in philosophy of ed.
I think we did.
We did. Yeah.
And there's sort of a natural, what is it, reducto ad Hitlerum, or whatever the expression is. The example that people always hold up is, well, what about the Nazi school? And the reality is there is not exactly robust market demand for Nazi schools. But there is a real market for Islamic schools. And to be clear, I'm sure that some of these schools are absolutely fine and don't pose any sort of concern. But when we look at what's going on in Europe and frankly, what's starting to manifest
in the U.S., Jason has put up on social media various instances of U.S. private schools that identify as Muslim schools, where they're wearing military uniforms, putting on headbands, chanting slogans about death to the Juden or something like that. Those are that there is enough of a market demand for that kind of school that they do exist in the United States. And we can look at Europe and see that it's not just a fringe thing, that it could be on scale.
Right.
So that's on one side of your ledger. What's on the other side of your ledger?
Well, and I mean, look, cards on the table. I'm not a libertarian. I would consider myself center right. So that's not something I look at and say, well, somehow, the free marketplace of ideas is going to sort itself out. I don't believe that. I think it's a real, it's a real threat to U.S. U.S. values and U.S. interests. But of course, the other side of this is how. Okay, if we identify this as a concern and a threat, how do we go about regulating it? Where do we draw that line? Because I also don't want to invite in massive government encroachment where they're saying, okay, you have to ascribe to a particular set of values or jump through these hoops to validate that you're engaging in appropriate.
Look, I mean, I think that's coming with the federal tax credit. Is a real battle over this very issue. And there's some suspicion that Governor Polis in Colorado, I don't, what's the right way to pronounce
I actually don't know what the correct pronunciation
is. That he's the only Democratic governor to have signed up for participating in the federal tax credit. And there's some suspicion that he's doing so in part to make the case that scholarship granting organizations should be restricted to giving scholarships for schools that do not run afoul of certain values. And among those values would be schools that in any way were discriminatory against LGBTQ. And depending on how you interpreted that requirement, it might exclude almost all religious schools, because almost all traditional religious schools have some sort of prohibition on LGBTQ, and so so it's unclear if Colorado's governor is going to be able to impose that restriction on SGOs, scholarship granting organizations operating in Colorado. I think that there's a push to have the regulation for this law, and the law, by the way, is very ambiguous about exactly how it's supposed to be done. So a lot of this is going to be decided in regulation. And I think there's a push to making it so that governors are not the ones who decide which SGOs participate. And therefore, Colorado couldn't decide to exclude this. But this is a live issue where people are going to attempt to impose various other value orthodoxies. And so the question is, are there kind of consensus values that are consensus enough that we can reasonably agree to restrict participation of private schools in subsidized programs, or whether it's really just all a matter of taste and highly varied in that we either are going to have too much restriction or kind of a completely unrestricted environment. And like you, I'm not smart enough to know exactly how this is all supposed to work out.
Yeah. I mean, there probably are some consensus. And when I say consensus, I mean, you could probably get 90+% of people to say, okay, this seems like a reasonable limitation. So there probably are some consensus values that we could impose, such as saying that the school can't actively root for the destruction of the United States. But, this gets back to some of the curriculum wars that we really saw, a couple of years ago, where there were these ideas of bringing in curriculum transparency and ensuring that schools weren't teaching radical content. I mean, it's one thing to say that we're going to provide oversight and make sure this isn't happening, but it's another thing actually to engage in that oversight. It's really, really hard to know. And so, there's an implementation concern here. Even if we say we can't have the Death to America school, that it could still happen.
Right. And there's an implementation concern in the other direction, which is we may drive out perfectly innocuous schools that should be within bounds because we're going to overregulate. And so we'll have to see how that plays out. But don't you worry, there is no restraint on the promotion of radicalism in higher education. And this speaks to a report that I issued this week with Defense of Freedom Institute, which is about the foreign-fueled radicalism of graduate student unions that are affiliated with K-12 teacher unions. So the basic story here is that K-12 unions have a shrinking core membership. So the number of K-12 teachers is going to shrink over time because the population in K-12 schools is going to shrink over time because of birth dearth, right? So they could see that they need to expand. And they've been doing this for a while, of looking for areas of expansion. And in fact, they very heavily have expanded into allied health fields. So Ian and I are also do no harm people here. And we work with that organization. And so the unions are making their way into that world as well. But one of the areas they're looking to expand into is higher education. And in particular, they have begun organizing graduate students in higher education. And one of the weird things about that is that graduate students at selective universities are heavily foreign. So they are in the United States on temporary, what are supposed to be temporary visas, F1 visas, but unions are organizing and representing foreigners in the United States, which is strange.
It is.
And then, not surprisingly, when they represent the interests of foreigners in the United States, they spend a lot of time, devoted a lot of energy to promoting the foreign policy agendas of the foreign students who they represent. And so you get stuff like this, which is was promoted by the graduate student union at Brown University. And you could see that, well, there isn't a lot in here about the things that you would think unions might be focused on, like wages, benefits, working conditions. But instead, it's something about imperialist war machine and, don't worry, they do speak out on Iran, but it's in favor of the regime. So, just in case you're worried. And in fact, what I did in this report is I went through, there are 26 unions graduate student unions affiliated with K-12 teacher unions. I went through their public communications, and basically 3/4 of them have taken very vocal positions critical of Israel. And when I say very, I mean the language is over the top and obsessive, hundreds of public communications on the matter. And then I compared it to how much they talk about Iran or Ukraine, which are other conflicts going on in the world. And they barely talk about that. A little bit more about Iran, but that's divided, where half speak favorably about the protests and half speak favorably about the regime. Or not favorably about the regime, at least critical of any effort to do something about the regime. And so, these are really extreme foreign policy perspectives being advocated by organized labor in the United States. And what's shocking, especially about that, is that we have a history with this. So early in the history of organized labor, the international communist movement was heavily involved and wanted to use organized labor in the United States as a means of promoting international communism. That threat became very clear to US policymakers, who passed a law in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act, in which they really tried to crack down on this. And they made actually the leaders of American unions submit affidavits that none of the leaders of their affiliates were part of the Communist Party. And that passed court muster, by the way. That was not because unions receive special privileges. It's not merely a question of whether they have a right to speak. People have a right to be communists and to speak in favor of communism. But if you want to be part of an organization that presents its cases in front of the National Labor Relations Board, that's a privilege. And in exchange for that privilege, there are some restrictions and expectations. And one of them is that you're not part of the international communist movement. And what this did is it helped the anti-communists within organized labor prevail, and they purged the communists, for the most part, from organized labor after World War II. And organized labor was focused to a large degree on the things you would expect them to be focused on.
Labor issues?
Labor issues, wages, benefits, working conditions. And these unions were also explicitly, self-consciously patriotic and anti-communist. And one of them in particular was the American Federation of Teachers, who under the longtime leadership of Al Schenker was known for their patriotic perspective and their anti-communist perspective, and importantly, their standing up to anti-Semites. So there was a particular controversy in Brooklyn, in New York, where Black Power activists and other radicals decided that only Black teachers could teach Black students. And of course, what this meant was that we had to get rid of all the existing teachers in those schools. The existing teachers there were a lot of Jews. And so there was a lot of anti-Semitism being hurled at the Jewish teachers in these predominantly Black schools. And Schenker, trying to defend the teachers and protect their jobs, was himself the recipient of a lot of anti-Semitic abuse from Black Power activists and other leftist radicals. And then the cruel irony is that the Brown Union that promotes this that you see is affiliated with the AFT.
Right.
Okay. This is Al Schenker's union.
Well, this AFT is very different from the AFT of yesterday. I mean, the idea of the union only being engaged on labor issues, where I only have to be concerned that the union, that the most nefarious thing that they're doing is protecting the jobs of bad teachers. If only we still lived in that.
I know. I pine for the days when they would just protect bad teachers.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true. I mean, now I have to worry about, communism, anti-Semitism, gender ideology, anti-Americanism. It's really like it is a hotbed of radical activity.
So this is at the University of Michigan. Their graduate student union also organized, affiliated with the AFT. And you can see in this image on the left, it's a post where they say, paging University of Michigan faculty. If you have tenure, what's stopping you? And that is Edward Said throwing rocks at Israel. So basically, this is the graduate student union calling out the faculty at the University of Michigan for being too cowardly to fight the Israelis and throwing rocks at them. Okay. But it's not just, they don't just hate Israel and Jews. Don't worry. They also hate America and they love communism. And so in their recruitment materials, they have, for example, Karl Marx driving a car and he says, beep, beep, losers, get in. And I guess that appeals to young people to talk like that. I don't know. I don't
get in, loser. We're doing something or other. But I do enjoy the fact that Marx is in a convertible, which, tend to not be.
Well, I mean, maybe his hair would really kind of, blow beautifully in the wind of being in a convertible. I don't know. Although, honestly, I didn't know that the people would make such indulgent bourgeois luxuries as convertibles when there are people starving somewhere, So
very, very serious messaging here.
Right. So look, I think that the report documents one of these things after another. I mean, it's hundreds of these communications. It's the bulk of what they do in their public communications is attack Jews, attack capitalism, attack America. It's pretty much, the foreign policy objectives of a lot of the countries from which some of these students come. Mm-hmm. And some of these countries sponsor them to come, make it possible for them to come. And so not surprisingly, they use the opportunity of coming here then to take advantage of our organized labor laws, have the special status of being organized labor and engaging in collective bargaining, forcing all the other graduate students to pay dues for this because they're part of the collective bargaining, and then basically using the organization for the purposes of promoting foreign radical agendas, which is the very thing we tried to drive out with Taft-Hartley.
So part of the obvious solution would be to limit the number of international students that we allow to come to the United States. I mean, you've spoken about this, the fact that at some point the cultural exchange, it's not just us impressing our values on them, it starts to go in the other direction at some point. And I imagine
that's right. And look, I mean, this is not, there are many talented foreign students who are valuable contributors to higher education. They help improve in general the educational environment by bringing their different experiences and knowledge. And they can be very smart and capable contributors to research activities. That's all true, but the benefit is not linear. It's not if it's good to have 5% foreign students, then it's 10 times better to have 50%.
Right.
And I think what's happened here is that we've gone beyond the reasonable benefits of foreign exchange. And gone into the dangerous territory of transforming the American institutions that are supposed to train the future elite of the United States to transform them from being U.S. institutions into being global institutions or foreign institutions.
Right.
And I think that transformation is occurring at a number of our elite universities, and which are the ones where the foreign percentage is much higher. It's also important for people to keep in mind, and I think this is misunderstood, is that the bulk of these foreign students are in graduate school. They're not undergraduates. And because they're in graduate school, they very often don't pay tuition and in fact receive a stipend. So it's not as if this cross-subsidizes the tuition of American students. Universities are not admitting them because they're a gigantic revenue source.
So this is actually us furnishing our own destruction.
Right, but it's not as if they're doing it for the money. Right. Like we always think, oh, the university, they do it for the money. And that's a good first guess, but it is not the case here. First, the amount of tuition revenue that Brown gets is a small percentage of their total revenue, right? They don't live off of tuition. Harvard less so, Brown a little more so. Even University of Michigan, they're getting a lot of revenue from things other than tuition. And they get even much smaller from foreign students because a lot of these students are in graduate programs where they don't pay tuition.
Right.
The reason why they are there, though, is that they're the cheap labor who run universities. They run the labs, they teach the intro classes. Frankly, this gives them disproportionate power and influence in the university because they have a ton of undergraduates that they're influencing. They have espionage potential because they have access to our cutting edge research activities. And so that's where they are. They're there in large numbers in graduate school, and that's who's being organized by the AFD are the graduate students.
This comes back to a conversation we keep having. Whether is it conviction or is it financial interest? And there's probably some level of conviction here too.
On the part of the AFT to organize these people?
On the part of university leaders believing that it's a good thing to run an international university, that they're actually doing, that they're performing some sort of positive service by allowing all these international students in.
Well, look, but it's also a pipeline. Part of why there's a conviction is that there's a pipeline in. So the graduate students who come from abroad with F1 visas, they stay extra years under the optional practical training program. They can stay up to 3 extra years working in a related field, meaning you get a PhD in chemistry and then you work as a tech in the lab for 3 more years, so you're there longer. And then maybe you get a postdoc, which is under an H-1B visa. H-1B visas are the numbers unlimited for universities, just like F1 visas are unlimited for universities, no cap, so they can hire as many as they want. And again, they're cheap labor to run labs or be postdocs, and then they become faculty. and then they become administrators, and then they adopt policies that are favorable to this worldview, or they influence their US-born colleagues towards these views. So they're shaping the culture of the institutions. I mean, I don't want to deny that there's plenty of domestically generated radicalism that's affecting higher ed, but it's fueled by foreign influences too.
I keep thinking of, so you and I went to Israel on a mission trip 2 years ago, organized out of UCLA. If those who are listening aren't familiar, you can find an article I wrote in the Wall Street Journal called "Israel Takes the E Out of DEI," where I wrote about the trip. But one of the experiences on that trip that really stuck with me was, I believe, is it Bar-Ilan University? It's the Technion that's in Haifa.
Yeah.
But we were there. I believe it was there where we met with the university president. And he said he wakes up every day and he thinks about, how can my university advance the interests of my people in my country? And it's almost like you can't even imagine an American university president saying that, right? Like it would.
Well, I mean, when Vannevar Bush proposed the kind of grand bargain between higher education and the federal government that led to the system of large subsidy of higher education that universities currently enjoy, it was on the heels of the successful collaboration between universities and the U.S. government to win World War II.
Right.
And the whole idea was to advance American interests in the world through this partnership. And
so how do we get back to that?
How do we get back to that? That's an excellent question. I think some of it is adopting reasonable policies and laws to restrict the flow of foreigners into higher ed and who stay in higher ed to influence. So not eliminating, but just putting caps on the number of F1 visas, putting caps on the number of H1B visas. Just as Google has a cap, these places should have a cap as well. And then I think another part of it is denying access to certain privileges like organized labor for graduate student unions that are heavily foreign. So we of course want there to be organized labor, but we want organized labor to represent Americans and to advocate for wages, benefits, and working conditions for American workers, not foreigners. And so we might reasonably look at how we make it so that these graduate student unions can't organize, don't get recognized, or to make it so that unions that do facilitate this are disadvantaged in receiving subsidy or unable to receive subsidy from the federal government. I think those are all reasonable steps.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, so one more question for you. I'm curious. When you pointed this out, and I believe maybe others as well, the campus Tentifada movement, when that was raging, let's say in 2024, you made the observation that it seemed to be disproportionately women who were engaged in that. Did you observe that here?
Yes. So the head of the University of Michigan GEO, the Graduate Employees Organization, is a woman who describes herself. Let me find the exact language. Because it's just too on point. Okay. She hilarious. This is actually a Brown. Although I at the University of Michigan, I just have to read this. They're big time partners with the Tahrir Coalition, which describes itself as, quote, a movement dedicated to the liberation of all people. We advocate for resistance against systems of domination and struggle to destroy their manifestations at the University of Michigan, throughout Turtle Island, and across the globe. We act in solidarity with freedom fighters in Palestine and revolutionaries everywhere working to dismantle global imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. I mean, like,
are there any buzzwords they didn't get in there? I can't think of
the efficiency of it. Like you could tell they're scientists, that they've perfected this. But no, what I was looking for is the head of the graduate student union at Brown, when these when the protests were being launched and when they decided to make it a priority, was a woman named Sharina Razek, who describes herself as, quote, a diasporic Palestinian feminist educator, scholar, activist, and labor organizer. And she decided, she explained that, quote, the union's decision to focus on divestment was her priority. And of course it is. You know, like, what would we expect from a diasporic Palestinian feminist educator, scholar, activist?
Right. I mean, right. That speaks, like, you know, it's such a good illustration of your point, right? It's her priority, but why would it be the priority of other people in that union? It's bizarre.
Right. I mean, you know, I don't know. There are people who are, you know, want to like study Latin poetry or something, and they want to get paid. And honestly, you know, the truth is, graduate students get lousy stipends.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a great deal. Part of why there's so many foreigners and so few Americans is because it's just not that attractive of a job.
Yeah.
You'd have to spend, you know, I don't know, 6 years maybe getting a PhD in a lot of places, living, you know, 6 to a shared house in Somerville, Massachusetts. You know, that looks pretty unattractive to a lot of native-born Americans. But to someone from Syria, it looks pretty good.
Someone,
you know, to weigh into the U.S. and you get to stay forever.
Yeah.
And because it's not hard to turn it into an H-1B and turn it into a green card.
Whatever we did with our Syrian-born gender studies PhDs.
I mean, there's some there. Honestly, there are going to be more. I mean, we sometimes think, oh, there are a lot of foreigners because they're good at math and we suck at math. And there's a little bit of truth in that, but it's actually not. It's that the Americans good at math are in finance.
Yeah.
You know, they're in hedge funds or something.
They want to make money. They're normal people. They want to make money. I get it.
Right. And they don't want to delay the launch of their professional lives until their mid-30s.
Yeah.
You know, but foreigners put up with lousy stipends, lousy working conditions. You know, they're being exploited like grape work. They're the grape workers of universities. And so I'm a little bit sympathetic to these graduate students. I see why they want a labor union. If only they could have a labor union that actually paid attention to those things as opposed to dismantling the global system of imperialism, capitalism, and patriarchy.
That's right.
So anyway, this has been fun having lunch. I hope you're all not too full. Since we left dessert out. And we'll see you next week at the same EFI time, same EFI place for lunch with EFI. And thanks for joining us.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye.